Behavior speaks for itself. You profiled me the moment you saw me. You fabricated violations. You escalated without cause. And you made threats to intimidate me into submission. She stepped even closer, her presence now towering over him despite her calm demeanor. "Do you want to know the worst part?" she asked, her voice lowering just enough to force him to lean in. "This isn't the first time, is it? It's a pattern. You thought no one was watching, that there would never be consequences. But today we watched. We recorded. And now there will be consequences." The officer stumbled backward, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. I was just doing my job," he said weakly, the confidence in his voice completely gone. "No," she replied sharply, her voice rising for the first time. "You were abusing your authority. You were breaking the law you swore to uphold. And now, the law will hold you accountable." She turned her head slightly, nodding to one of the agents. A device was handed to her, a small screen that lit up with video footage. She held it up for the officer to see, the playback showing every word, every action, every abuse. His knees buckled slightly as he realized the gravity of what he was seeing. There was no escape, no justification, no way to spin this. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was all tied back to him. The woman lowered the device, stepping back with a final, piercing gaze. "This is bigger than you," she said quietly. "You're a symptom of a system that needs to change. And today, you become the example." Her words hung in the air like a verdict, sealing his fate as the weight of the moment crushed the last remnants of his arrogance. He had thought he was untouchable, but now, faced with the truth, he realized just how wrong he had been. The officer stood frozen, his world crumbling around him. The weight of the evidence and the woman's unshakable authority left him paralyzed. But she wasn't finished. This wasn't just about him. It was about something far greater, and she was about to make it clear. The woman turned to face the group of officers who had arrived moments earlier. Their backup cars lined along the road like a fleet of uncertainty. Their postures were rigid, their expressions unreadable, but their silence spoke volumes. They had seen everything, they had heard everything, and they had done nothing. She addressed them, her voice cutting through the stagnant air. "To the officers standing here now," she began, her tone carrying both gravity and finality. "Your silence does not absolve you. It condemns you. Complicity is a choice. Inaction is a decision. And today, your decision will not go unnoticed." The officers shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other, others at the ground. No one spoke. The woman continued, her words sharper than a blade. "All footage and audio from this encounter have been captured and preserved. Not just from my vehicle," she said, gesturing toward her car, "but from multiple angles, multiple devices. Drones, dash cams, and witnesses. Everything you've said, everything you've done or failed to do has been documented." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the group like a storm cloud. Then she turned back to the offending officer, whose face had gone pale. "This evidence will be submitted to federal oversight for immediate review," she said, her voice unyielding. "You will face disciplinary action, effective immediately. Your badge, your authority, and your power are no longer yours to abuse." The officer stumbled, his words barely a whisper. "You can't do this. You can't just take everything away." But she didn't waver. "I'm not taking anything away from you," she said, her tone cold and exacting. "You gave it up the moment you chose to abuse the trust placed in you. You gave it up the moment you decided to act as if you were above the law." She gestured to one of the agents, who stepped forward with a clipboard. "Every officer present at this scene will now be subject to an internal investigation," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of a judge delivering a sentence. "Your department has failed to police itself, so now we will. Every complicit act, every moment of silence, every abuse of power will be unearthed, and those responsible will face the full weight of accountability. The other officers looked around uneasily, their confidence eroding under her scrutiny. One of them finally spoke, his voice hesitant. We didn't know. We didn't realize." She turned to him sharply, her gaze like steel. "Ignorance is not a defense," she said firmly. "You chose not to act when you knew better. You stood by, and now you'll answer for it." The officer who had instigated the stop now stood alone, his once commanding presence reduced to nothing. His hands trembled, his face a mask of disbelief. He tried to speak, to plead, but the woman silenced him with a single look. "This isn't just about you," she said, her voice low but powerful. "This is about every person who has been mistreated, every victim who didn't have a camera, every moment that went unrecorded. Today, we make it clear. The system you relied on to protect you will no longer shield you from justice." She stepped back, her agents closing in to secure the scene. The officers who had arrived as reinforcements now found themselves under scrutiny, their roles reversed, their authority stripped away. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, the road that had once been quiet was now a stage for a reckoning, one that would echo far beyond this single moment. The woman stood firm, the embodiment of justice, as those who had abused their power finally faced the consequences of their actions. The officer's bravado had crumbled entirely, his once confident stance reduced to trembling uncertainty. His hands hung at his sides, his face pale, his breath uneven as the full weight of the moment bore down on him. The truth was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. For the first time, he understood the magnitude of his actions, and with it came the crushing realization that there was no escape. "Please," he stammered, his voice shaking, almost unrecognizable. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just doing my job." The woman, standing tall and resolute, watched him with unwavering eyes. There was no pity in her gaze, no sympathy for his sudden regret. She let his words linger in the air for a moment, then stepped forward, her presence commanding silence. "Your job," she repeated, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Is your job to lie, to threaten, to intimidate, and abuse those you swore to protect?" Her words were sharp, cutting through the officer's feeble defenses. He shook his head, desperation creeping into his voice. I didn't mean it like that. I made a mistake. I didn't know who you were." Her eyes narrowed and her voice rose, steady and firm. "It doesn't matter who I am. It matters who you are. You didn't act this way because of my title or my position. You acted this way because of my skin, because you thought you could. You thought there would be no consequences." The officer stumbled over his words, his excuses faltering under the weight of her truth. It's not like that. I've been a good officer. I've done my job for years. And how many of those years were built on the backs of people you thought couldn't fight back?" she countered, her voice rising with righteous anger. "How many lives have you ruined because they didn't have the resources or the power to hold you accountable? You don't get to claim ignorance now. You knew exactly what you were doing." The officer dropped his gaze, his shoulders slumping. I can change," he mumbled weakly. "Just give me a chance to make it right." But the woman stood firm, her voice unyielding. "Change isn't a promise. It's an action. And you won't change until you're held accountable, until you face the consequences of your choices. That's what justice is. It's not just for the victims. It's for the system that allows people like you to thrive unchecked." She stepped closer, her words now carrying the weight of generations. "You aren't the problem alone. You are the symptom of a system that has been broken for far too long. But today, we begin to dismantle it, piece by piece. And you will be the first." Her gaze pierced through him, and for the first time, the officer truly understood. This wasn't just about his actions today. This wasn't just about him. He was part of something larger, something deeply flawed, and now he was a catalyst for its unraveling. The silence stretched heavy and final. As her words sank in, the officer looked around, seeking something, anything to grasp onto. But there was nothing. No shield, no protection, no escape. Only the truth and the consequences it demanded. And as the woman turned away, her team moving to finish the work they had started, the officer was left standing alone, the echoes of her words reverberating in his mind. Justice had come, and it was unstoppable. The officer stood in the center of the chaos he had created, his face a portrait of defeat. His badge, once a symbol of authority, now seemed like a weight pulling him down. The woman's words still echoed in the air, unrelenting and final. Justice was here, and there was no escape. One of the agents stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "Officer," the agent said firmly, "you are hereby placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Hand over your badge and weapon." The officer hesitated, his trembling hands hovering over his holster. His eyes darted to the woman, as if hoping for leniency, but her expression was unmoved, unshakable. There would be no reprieve. Slowly, he removed his badge and sidearm, placing them into the waiting hands of the agent. The sound of the metal against the clipboard was final, like the closing of a door he would never reopen. Nearby, the other officers who had arrived as backup watched silently, their faces pale. They, too, understood that their inaction had been documented, that their complicity would not go unpunished. The agents moved methodically, gathering evidence, securing footage, and taking statements. This was no longer a roadside stop. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The woman stood at the center of it all, calm and composed. She watched as her team efficiently dismantled the facade of impunity that had shielded this officer and so many others like him. When the work was done, one of the agents approached her. "Everything secured, ma'am. We're ready to move forward." She nodded, her gaze lingering on the officer one last time. "Good," she said. "Make sure every piece of evidence is submitted to the task force. This isn't just about him. It's about the system that allowed him to act this way." With that, she turned and began to walk back to her car. Her steps were deliberate, each one carrying the weight of the moment. The agents parted to let her pass, their respect evident in their silence. She reached her vehicle, opened the door, and paused. And glory was restored to the police system. If you watched up to this point, thank you. Kindly support my channel by hitting the subscribe button. That encourages me to keep coming with more exciting stories.